Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. If I were to ask you what the central event in the New Testament is, you'd have an answer just like that. It's the birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. Central to the whole New Testament. If I would ask you the same thing about the Old Testament, would you have as quick an answer? I can tell you what it is, and it's not very different from the central event in the New Testament. The central event in the Old Testament is the Exodus. It's God delivering his people from bondage. Not very different from what he's doing with Jesus Christ in the New Testament. What makes that central in the Old Testament is that actually Genesis has led up to that. Genesis introduced the problem of sin. It introduced sin in families, in the world, and how it impacted all of life. And then it introduced how a nation of 70 people ended up in Egypt. And Exodus picked up how a nation of 70 people had grown to 3 million and suffered under bondage in Egypt. That central event is an event of deliverance. It's actually an event of war. God had sent Moses back to Egypt, where he'd grown up, to bring his people out. And if you pick it up at chapter 5, Exodus chapter 5, verse 1, afterward Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Now, I don't know if you noticed that in your Sunday school lesson. What Moses is asking is just let us go out into the wilderness, have a festival, and implied is, we'll come right back. Pharaoh's response is no. In fact, he makes life more miserable for the Israelites, takes away the straw that was used in making bricks so that they not only had to make the bricks, but now they had to gather the straw. And the people respond with something that will become a common theme through the rest of Exodus and into Numbers. When they found out that they were going to have to gather on straw, they said to Moses and Aaron, in verse 21 of chapter 5, "Yahweh look upon you and judge, because you've made us offensive in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. And we have grumbling round one." I counted them one time. There are 14 or 15 times, I don't remember exactly which, but 14 or 15 times in that Exodus event that Israel will complain about their circumstances, will grumble about their situation. So another theme going on in this Exodus event, you remember the story of the plagues. The first plague, of course, was the striking the Nile. That's in chapter 7. When Pharaoh refuses to let the people go, Moses says, okay, suffer the consequences. And the Nile is struck and turned to blood, turned red. Interestingly, the Nile was an Egyptian god. They saw it as the life-giving artery of the nation, an Egyptian god. The next plague is in chapter 8, and it's frogs. And there's a certain irony here because frogs also are Egyptian gods. And the nation is buried in its own gods. They've got more gods than they know what to do with. The frogs are everywhere. If you follow those plagues through, most of them will link up with some Egyptian god. The cattle get boils, the cattle were gods. The sun is blocked out, the sun was a god. If you follow most of those plagues through, you'll see them linked up to the Egyptian scheme of theology. What you have in the Exodus event, especially in these plagues, is really holy war. God fighting for his people. God could have arranged it so Moses went in and said, let my people go, and Pharaoh said, okay, just go, get out of here. But he didn't. In fact, he's going to impress upon his people the power of Yahweh versus the power of the Egyptian gods. And he's not just going to make a little point of it, he's going to make a huge point of it until he finally just grinds the Egyptian gods into the dust under his heel. The last plague, the one we'll talk a little bit about more in the next session, but the last plague, the Passover, takes even the life of the son of the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was a god, and what God has done is take on the next Egyptian god and do away with him. If you want to look at holy war in the Old Testament, the time when God fights for his people, a beautiful time to look at it is in those plagues in the Exodus. God fights against the gods of Egypt, grinds them into the dust, and shows that he indeed is God. And he steps into history to release his people from bondage. Again, not very different from what he has done for us in Jesus Christ.